what I look forward to, and the people who are developing it and the people who are fixing it, whether it's the cloud side, the development side, the infrastructure side, they know how to do what needs to be done. They just need clear direction. Oh, it's this code snippet. There was a syntax error. This needs to be corrected, and this is where it needs to be corrected. And if I know that, I can then automate it. Like my nirvana would be that there's somebody had said that cloud security should be more like an airbag than a seatbelt, where you physically put on a seatbelt. Cloud security should be the airbag. Like if you hit something, it's going to pop up and it's just there to protect you.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we're going to dig into cloud security, what it is, what is the sort of the past, present, future of it, and all sorts of other stuff. And to talk about all of that, we have Rick Doten with us. Rick, thanks for joining the show here and coming to kind of share some knowledge and practices.
Thank you for having me.
So Rick, let's start by maybe defining a little bit like cloud security. I think probably has 17 different interpretations of it. What's your definition? So what is cloud security?
The main difference, I would say, is the shared service model. And that is that you don't have full responsibility from the hardware all the way up to the software and the user. Depending on whether you're an infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, that may vary from how much or a little or a lot that the cloud service provider is going to be providing some kind of service. So for instance, at software as a service, you don't only have the infrastructure, but also the application and maybe the identity management and the patching of the application, things like that. So sharing of what you're responsible and what you don't is really like the core of what it is. But there's still a lot of things that are very important that you're responsible for no matter what the circumstance, such as data protection, identity management, and then also vulnerability management and response to issues. But there is certainly big differences between traditional perimeter and data center security than cloud security.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great distinction between kind of, I guess, the data center, sort of, the on-premise, versus the cloud. But then within the cloud security oftentimes kind of lumps in sort of the infrastructure as a service security and cloud security, maybe even in your definition, like even like a managed service that you're sort of, hosting services that you own, but someone else manages might even fall kind of in that category. I guess, is it right to think about, call it like, say, SaaS security all the way to IaaS security as cloud security as a bucket? Like, is there some kind of enough similarity almost between the two of them to put them under the same title?
Well, data and workloads being in the cloud, it kind of goes into the thing that I was talking about. And so when you're doing security operations for it, depending on those levels, and that's why I feel like you can't get away from whether it's infrastructure platform or software as a service, what you're trying to protect, because you don't need to worry about. And even in infrastructure as a service, if you are a company who doesn't do greenfield development of your own applications and you're just really using the cloud as a virtual data center, then it's very similar. And you're usually having virtualized environments where instead of containerized environments, for instance, which you would normally do if you were doing your own workloads and making your own applications. So even within infrastructure as a service, it might be different. So my short answer is it really is different depending on how you're using cloud as a consumer. And then if you're providing security services for that, the things you worry about in software as a service, again, maybe more about identity and configuration and data protection, where in infrastructure, more about APIs. And then when you get down to infrastructure, more about your containers or infrastructure as code and governance as code and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting distinction between the levels because it's almost, I guess, the way you present it, it's almost an accumulation of things. So if you're looking at SaaS security, there's a bunch of things that you need to worry about. If you're going to do platform as a service, you need to do all of the above of sort of the SaaS, and then you need to do some additional things. Maybe there's some tweaks to them. And then if you're going to do IaaS, you do even more doing it. But we haven't, like as an industry, we haven't invented terms for the subsets, right? So when someone says cloud security, you kind of need to interpret from the context whether they
very broad,
because it's a very different, I guess the most important things or the most important risks for, say, SaaS security are quite different than those for IaaS security.
Right. And as you mentioned with IS security, there's levels within that. Like I said, are you just using it as a data center replacement, or are you really doing development? Because if you then are doing development and you have a whole CI/CD pipeline, that's what's kind of changed in the last 10 years is our SDLC. And when we were integrating security in the SDLC, it kind of ends with, okay, now it gets pushed into production. But in a CI/CD pipeline, it extends into the infrastructure. The infrastructure is part of it. It can't be decoupled from it. And that's the thing that I really kind of learned the last 5 years is that when I was looking at modern application security and, from the late 90s to late 2000s, I ran application pen test teams and we used to train development teams of our customers, secure coding and all the basic stuff. And when I went back to look at, okay, where are we now? The really thing that I found is like the infrastructure is so embedded with it because of that infrastructure as code and the governance and the heavy reliance on API and service accounts and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true and kind of has intertwined in it. And so I'm just sort of curious a little bit about, I don't know if I'm stuck a little bit on this taxonomy things, although like, if we sort of want to align on it, but you've been very involved with the Cloud Security Alliance and a variety of sort of buddies over here, but there hasn't been like any choice of naming, right? Like for the top 10 sort of security concerns for cloud security, for instance, also lumps in kind of these different buckets, right?
Yeah, the Cloud Security Alliance has a top 11. I don't know why I picked 11. Maybe they're like prime numbers that of the security of cloud security issues. And when you look at them, 80% of them are configuration error, weak credentials or misconfigurations or things like that. And then, but they're not as like meaty as like the OWASP top 10 or what we've learned in BSIM, right? But they're kind of general because the infrastructure is really not much different than what we traditionally, it's just that we have a lot more access points. The thing I've loved about the cloud security as a topic is it's kind of reintroduced threat modeling to the world. Something that I did back in the late 2000s, and then Microsoft published their book in 2005 about it. And then we kind of like it kind of fizzles off because it's kind of hard. But now cloud security, it really, really lends itself to doing a threat model because there's so many different entry points, so many different access levels, so many different dependencies that we really need to map this out and see what it is. But I go back to your statement that, yes, when you say cloud security, it's just like saying, hey, I need a security person. Like what flavor? There are so many different types of it. And what is your circumstance? And I think that's a challenge in our industry is that we're trying to play to the least common denominator. We're trying to make it, if you just do this, you'll be okay, which is very rarely the case. But we don't want to be too complex about it by saying, well, here are 15 different circumstances and your mileage may vary depending on your circumstance.
Right. Yeah. And I guess you can get too granular or too abstract here pretty easily. I'll get off the sort of the taxonomy bandwagon so we can get to sort of the meat of it, a little bit of it. So let's talk about cloud security. And maybe, like, I think, tell me if you agree that when we talk about cloud security in the industry, kind of the majority of attention is on IS security, because I think most cloud usage is probably SaaS, but most cloud security concerns are in IS security because there's just, I guess, kind of more ways to shoot yourself in the foot. Are we aligned there?
Yes, because as the consumer, I have more responsibility to it.
Right. Yeah. Which makes sense.
Where I'm kind of like transferring as risk can be accepted, mitigated, or transferred. I've transferred the risk of most of the security for SaaS solution to them, and I have a much smaller piece.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. So it's like in the shared ownership, you kind of own more. And so you need to own about it. So let's sort of define maybe what is like 101 in terms of cloud security in it. What are the basics that really, if you're totally kind of fresh to it, you have to do these things to just sort of consider yourself almost like allowed, to use IS in a secure fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is still no different. The fundamentals are no different than data center. And so, as you know, I'm on the editorial panel of the CIS critical security controls. And we talk about the most basic controls like 1 through 6, which is asset management, got to know what it is, and cloud, it applies. The data protection, which applies, configuration management, vulnerability management, and identity management. And so if we cover those basics, those are still where you start. Because we talk about phantom networks and cloud and people spinning up stuff and not knowing about it. That's important to kind of know what your infrastructure is and then where the data is, what the data is. I mean, again, just the very basics. And even with all of this ransomware related to infrastructures, not necessarily cloud, that it's the basics that really kill you and the fundamentals. And I think that that's one of the challenges is people kind of go towards the exceptional but unlikely scenarios because it's kind of the most scary thing and not focus on the fundamentals. And so if you just know where your stuff is, know where the data is protected, identities are protected, you're doing vulnerability and configuration management properly, you're 90% there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because on one hand, what you've described right now is the one-on-one, and on the other hand, the same list is the mastery of the sort of cloud. Like if you're in a place, so it's really about how well do you actually know what's running, where, who's allowed to do what. And so it really is about security hygiene levels. Are you just kind of washing your hands, or are you actually sort of
scrubbing
some clean room and sort of scrubbing? In both cases, all you're doing is keeping germs out, but to different levels of skill, I guess.
And I think the challenge in the implementation of those, it's so diverse as far as who's responsible. Because as organizations have evolved and moved into the cloud, it is no longer a simple relationship between the infrastructure people, the network people, and the application people, and the security people. Now there's cloud people, there's cloud architects, there's credential management, there's secrets management, there's APIs, there's all these different. So I have a keynote that I do about cloud security is a team sport, and politics get into play. Not politics as in posturing, but politics as in who's responsible. And that's what's also different about every organization is it's not cut and dry whether the cloud security team is the one to set all the standards. It's really who has the most influence. Because in large companies, most of the cloud teams are refugees from other parts of the company. They were former systems people or network people or application people or whatever that are now the cloud team, because obviously this is where we're going. They may bring their respect, or they were the application architects before, and now they're the cloud architects. And so they may have more influence on things. And it's also all those teams need to mature in education of what cloud is and what's unique about the cloud, and some of the more specifics I didn't get into about securing the cloud and not understanding it. And I think that that's where I've seen a lot of groups where the security team doesn't understand the uniquenesses of the cloud, where maybe the architects do and the developers do.
Yeah, which to an extent gets me back to taxonomy. It is because we call everything cloud security, so nothing is cloud security. And basically you can kind of choose the interpretation that most fits your sort of a context or background or sort of areas of interest. And so it's a challenge. But maybe another way to then think about, like, as we define starting points in the cloud. So one is kind of these 5 controls that you've enumerated and just kind of getting some initial handle, some sort of 80-20 on them. Another view maybe on like starting with the cloud is more about indeed the cloud maturity, because like instead of starting with cloud security, it's talking about the cloud itself. And so I guess is the starting point when you think about cloud security fundamentals, maybe it's related more to the applications. If you've kind of shifted and lifted applications from the data center and you're just running them in the cloud in the way you've described as just you're kind of outsourcing your data center, then you have an initial set of security controls. I guess if you're doing that, like let's say, kind of imagine a scenario, very common scenario, which is you just have a bunch of applications, you've shifted and lifted, you're running them in the cloud. Now you want to operate a cloud security program for those applications. You probably would come back to the same kind of 5 controls, but what changes, what's important to know to the changed between your data center approach before above and beyond the slices that you're now outsourcing and you don't need to worry about?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's a very common scenario. And it's kind of one I cringe at, because like, well, that's not the point of doing the cloud, because you're losing all of the value, the on-demand elastic and self-provisioning part. You're just kind of, I'm spinning up virtual machines, I'm cutting, pasting, and forklifting it up there. But what will change is, for instance, there are things such as the virtual networking, the credential management, the federated identity, the use of service accounts. Those things become a lot more in play. And so even doing standard vulnerability scanning, you're not just going to get Rapid7 or Nessus to just like scan it from the outside. It's isolated. I have virtual networks. And when you're doing security operations, that one IP address may represent multiple systems, or it might change on a regular basis depending on how you have it set up from just virtualized. And so those kinds of things become like little nuance changes that are different about it, because you're just moving to, again, a static environment, not temporary workloads, but you're in a cloud environment. And then you have the elements of how are my backups working? And then you have the privacy of the data, what area can be in, because in the cloud, you know where your data is. You can kind of geofence it to make sure that it's in the US or it's in Europe, and because of GDPR extend beyond Europe. But it's not like this was something that years ago, 12 years ago, as part of the Open Data Center Alliance, which I forget what they turned into. And I was on the board for regulatory committee. And the biggest risk of cloud security back in 2010 was one, your cloud provider going away, and then all your data is gone, and you're a Russian business network using it, and then Interpol takes it down, and you're like, you're done. Or two, the fact that you're locked in and the portability is not there. That still exists today to a lesser extent, but I can't just take my ball and go somewhere else. And so knowing where the data is, when they say, okay, go ahead and get me all my data back, I'm going to go do this thing. It's like, well, I don't know where it is. I'll just let it kind of dissipate and then eventually die off. So that understanding where you knew in your data center, your big array, storage array,
there was some big database
like, and you could point to, and it's like, there's my data.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So it's a fair bit. It's like a lot of it, even with the sort of the simple motion of lifting and shifting an application before you threw in elasticity, before you threw in infrastructure as code, because any of the sort of the fancy stuff, there's already kind of a fair bit that changes need to do it, which in turn implies people changes, right? Like it implies cultural, like how you talk to a lot of these different organizations and you see it within your org. I guess, what are your sort of likelihood of success if you try to kind of take the same team and maybe the same backgrounds and sort of skill sets and try to adapt them to the cloud? Like, is that your sort of path for success, or is it more likely for you to sort of go off and sort of hire different skill sets?
It can be. It really depends on the individuals. And that's like the variable is always the people. I have lots of discussions about workforce development and hiring and security, and it's really about personality and aptitude. And if you have people who want to move into the cloud because they want to learn, they want to expand and continue to learn, they're going to be fine. If you have people who just redirected, and I have a video that I did at RSA for the Cloud Security Alliance a couple of years ago about cloud security and how this new thing and how we address it is similar than going back 20 years or 25 years when we moved from Novell to TCP/IP networking, from wireless networks came in, when I had worked as a security consultant for a company and had a lot of bank customers, and when the bank ATMs, the automatic teller machines, were all IBM OS2 Warp, that end of life in 2005, and most of the ATMs moved to embedded XP. And that was a total change of these people who were used to, and then finally voice over IP with phone switches at the bottom of the buildings, and now complex networking gear. And so those changes were much drastic, because a phone switch person is not going to be a Cisco network or an Asterisk network person. A person who understood OS2 Warp at the end of some connecting back to a mini computer is not going to understand a finicky Windows endpoint and keeping up to date. And so your career is over doing that. Cloud, it can transition, because we're still talking about the same operating system, same concepts. There are just new ways of looking at it, new rules apply. And even I forgot to mention also the logging. In the cloud, I'll be logging maybe to this cloud, but then I got to take it back somewhere else to the data center, and which may cost me to move the data around, or if I go to another cloud environment, because that's where my SIM or my data log aggregation is. So that's, again, another little piece that you just need to kind of figure out. But I think if you have the right people, it'll be fine, kind of ramp up, because it's very, very hard to find security people, because everyone needs them and everyone wants them. And they're hard to find and they're hard to keep because they get poached.
Yeah, security industry as a whole, and then cloud security kind of in particular, is definitely sort of lacking for personnel. So I think that's kind of a good definition of sort of initial cloud security. And it sounds like, indeed, the competencies, a lot of these are things that you just need to learn to work in another environment. You might still run whatever the Nessus or wherever, you just might need to run it from within sort of your network.
Right. You install the agents on it and let it report back.
But a lot of
there's little things you have to do, right?
Maybe let's kind of move up in time a bit and sort of talk about, okay, now you're running an application that is cloud native, or at least sufficiently kind of cloud adapted to doing it. So it's using some elasticity, or like even a fair bit of elasticity. Maybe there's some serverless kind of thrown in, and there's some Kubernetes clusters kind of floating around, some infrastructure as code, maybe not everywhere. I mean, I think that's kind of a less, like more of a rarity. So you're kind of in that reality, you're more mature on your cloud journey. And let's say you kind of gotten the sort of the basics of your sort of control. So you're not a master of that. You sort of have some levels. What is the sort of the level up that you need, or sort of the additional competencies you should pay attention to as you kind of evolve that cloud activity? And specifically, like before we talked about this sort of security hygiene, are there like new security controls that you should mostly focus on? Or is your focus should be on like leveling up your security hygiene to sort of that more sort of dynamic surrounding?
Yeah, that's a much bigger leap. That's why it's good that you started with, okay, if I just forklift my applications up to be in the cloud instead of in a data center, as opposed to cloud native environments, like you said, containerized DevOps kind of, or, continuous, CI/CD development, because the cloud itself is an application. So when we talk about that pipeline extending, it's because the cloud is an application to the user. That's where things really, really, so it's like it's a jump from here to here, what we just described, and now there's a jump from here to there, because some traditional concepts no longer apply. The most basic one being, if you have temporary workloads, then if you have a policy to have an EDR running on all of your servers, it doesn't apply because it's only up for 2 minutes. It's just overhead and you're not going to see anything anyway. And there's no way to get anything out of it because it's an isolated workload that's doing its thing and going away. So you rely more on file integrity monitoring or posture management tools to kind of like make sure that your infrastructure is code scanning and make sure that, okay, do I trust this thing? If not, then I just wipe it out and I redo it until it gets trusted or I do something else. So how you do it becomes different. Security operations becomes very different because even though we talked about like the way that you're doing cloud security operations or even incident response, now when you have a bunch of temporary workloads that are going, they're sharing different things that are up for periods of time, and you're relying a lot more on APIs, a lot more on configuration files for infrastructure as code to people to call, you're relying on innumerable sources for the images to go through there, then your configuration management process needs a lot more scrutiny. And it's not much different than your standard code repo where you're keeping track of your but then that comes into play that now we have different teams that are responsible for the innumerable sources as opposed to the code, which opposed to the containers, opposed to the posture management, as opposed to the secrets management. So then it's just a lot more complicated. There's so much more value and your efficiencies that you're bringing in, and you can do so much, but it now just gets exponentially more complex. And then this is where the developers have more control as well. Instead of just, here's my application, I give it to somebody who then installs it and then kind of watches it. It's continuously going. The developers are getting further in because they may be doing infrastructure code. They may be having governance as code defined for them. And then finally, the remediation workflow is not as straightforward. Because if we go to a traditional virtual environment, something in the infrastructure, well, then that goes to the infrastructure people to fix it, patch it, et cetera, or configuration change. But if it's an infrastructure as code thing, depending on your organization and where it is or how it is in production, because you'll have different policies for in production and in development, then it might be that, okay, this particular serverless environment was kind of defined by the infrastructure people. They use ServiceNow to be able to do their workflow for remediation, where if it was an infrastructure as code developed through the code chain, then they would go to Jira and then they would go into their bug fix process for that. Or it might go to a Slack channel because this is something that's more dynamic that the CI/CD team is worrying about. So the chain of if something goes wrong or when you need to fix something may be different. So those are just some things that, to me, I'm very excited about because there's lots more opportunity to do things, but it just gets exponentially more complicated.
Yeah, and I agree with the complexity. And I guess with that, flexibility, I guess, brings with it a lot of potential unexpected paths and a lot of opportunities to mess it up. But if I kind of take what you described, of all the sort of the, I guess, dynamism and sort of maybe decentralization, also that sort of happens, right? Like different teams. It sounds like there are kind of two key buckets that oftentimes when you say DevSecOps, another sort of term that people kind of interpret to their heart's content. But if you say DevSecOps, then there are kind of these two interpretations. There are sort of what I would say is like the meta interpretation of bringing security into the DevOps fold, which tends to sort of maybe be a bit more software oriented, a bit more sort of inclusive of everything. And then there's the more operational, maybe coming more into the combination of the previous phase we talked about, which is just sort of managing this infrastructure in the cloud, and the ops side of what you've described now, the sort of the security operations, knowing what happens. The machine is not up there when you're trying to sort of, inspect if it's been compromised, all the different details. So I think kind of those two worlds, if I can sort of separate maybe the DevSecOps side from the sort of the remediation flow of it, I guess I'll repeat the question from before. Like for the ops side, are we talking same people? Is it like the same? And granted, people can get totally retrained and be totally, but like what percentage overlap would you say between the skills and kind of mindsets of the people in that sort of first bucket of a lifted and shifted cloud security team versus at least the ops side of this sort of more cloud native world?
Right. Yeah. It's certainly a lot more education, a lot more understanding of these diff technologies, and also will vary depending on which cloud infrastructure you're on as well, because what tools are valuable to you, how logging works, how often they kind of change the logs without telling you about it, and what tools that your development teams are using. My favorite definition of DevSecOps is really just the automation of the security, where I look at DevOps as automating an agile Scrum or XP process. Now I'm automating that. And then if I do DevSecOps, I'm automating that security portion as well. And the process is still the same, but I'm trying to get more automation into it because humans can't react that fast. But specific to your question about the humans, it's an increasing in the skill level and the understanding of the environment and how that whole CI/CD pipeline works and where they fit in. Because security people don't fix things. And this is what I tell companies all the time. Like, this is great, but I am not a lack of things to help me find problems. I'm at a lack of helping the people who are not me fix the problems. And this even came from years of pen testing. We struggle with the IT department of our customers to convince them this really needs to be fixed and how to fix it. And so when I look forward to, and the people who are developing it and the people who are fixing it, whether it's the cloud side, the development side, the infrastructure side, they know how to do what needs to be done. They just need clear direction. Oh, it's this code snippet. There was a syntax error. This needs to be corrected. And this is where it needs to be corrected. And if I know that, I can then automate it. Like my nirvana would be that somebody had said that cloud security should be more like an airbag than a seatbelt, where you physically put on a seatbelt. Cloud security should be the airbags. Like if you hit something, it's going to pop up and it's just there to protect you. So if I find really when we get into this level and high dynamic environment, as I said before, it's all about configuration management and vulnerability management and fixing these things or as they go along and automating that to where, okay, here's an issue. Here's what needs to be fixed. This is the patch that needs to go in. Here's the patch. Here's a button to install it. I'm going to send it to ServiceNow or Jira, whichever one, for the human to say, yes, approval workload. They press the button, it gets fixed. They press another button to back it out if there's a problem. And that's what we need to get to, because when organizations are doing dozens or hundreds of pushes a day and something could go wrong, we can't have, they've automated that. We can't have a manual process for security operations.
Security has to sort of adapt to the automation. So, I mean, that's a great, and actually, like when you think about sort of the automation, that's a great, basically, probably the sort of the pillar of that evolution from the lifted and shifted to sort of the dynamic environment. So in the sort of lifted and shifted environment, really it's around adapting to it being in the cloud. It's a lot of network changes, a lot of API entry points versus kind of maybe physical entry points. So that was the evolution. And the second one is, look, the pace is going to be high. You're not going to be able to keep up. And so it has to be automated. And that in turn is a bigger leap for people. Let me ask you a question. Like, we talk about this here as though it's an evolution. In practice, for almost any enterprise and for many companies that are smaller, it's coexistence, the sort of the first bucket of applications that you're just operating and the ones that you're building. They coexist. And again, we call them the same. Sorry, I kind of got stuck a little bit on like naming here. At Snyk, we've been sort of toying a bit recently, and in general in these conversations, I've been sort of increasingly thinking about this world of IT cloud versus the app cloud, sort of thinking to an extent in the definitions you've just given, that sort of the first bucket is really more of the IT cloud and the practices around it are more IT-like versus that sort of second bucket, the cloud native apps, which really it should be the app cloud and the behavior there should be more
good distinction between the two. Yeah.
And so I guess within that app cloud world, should it be, I mean, even in cloud native companies, and to be frank, even at Snyk, we sort of still, cloud security is always this murky thing about whether it is a part of the AppSec program or whether it is a part of kind of more the infrastructure, the IT security, sometimes enterprise security program. I even find that more often than I expected, it falls into the second bucket versus the former, even in like high growth startups and sort of scales. I mean, what do you think? Does that match what you're seeing? And what do you think is right? Like, should cloud security, app cloud security be part of the AppSec program versus the IT security?
And the standard answer is it depends. And that's where I go back to what I said before is like, who is the most influence? Who may have the most budget?
Yeah.
Who may have the most ability to make the change? In some organizations, the developer in a very large organization that has thousands of developers, they may be the bottom of the pile. And they could take their direction from the application architects who take it from the cloud architects, et cetera. And they have nothing. But if you are a small organization that all you do is develop applications, then the developers are king because they're making the business. And so then they would have more influence on them. It's certainly a best practice we're seeing is certainly embedding or developing security champions within the development team and the infrastructure team to be able to influence and mentor people in there, because it goes back to it's a team sport. And depending on how some small organizations may have a simpler time because they may have 2 security people, a bunch of developers, and some cloud architects. And then it's kind of easy because they all sit in the same room and it's like, Jeff, you do this, Nancy, you do that, and et cetera. Where a bigger company, which has 15 teams in describing all of that, then it's like, well, that's not my thing. Because that's one thing that we talk about a lot when talking to customers, like, hey, I think your technology is great, but I don't know who would buy it, because it's used by these 5 different teams and all of them would say, I'm not paying for it. That's this thing. Well, I'm not paying for that's the thing. I mean, every large company kind of has this. It's never a lack of money. It's like, who's willing to pay for it? And so the challenge is, and that's why I say it goes back to it depends. Your industry, whether you're highly regulated or not, whether you are a small organization, your size, location, whether it's a more of a privacy-based thing, in which case, if your company has a lot of privacy issues or regulatory issues, then security may have a governance risk compliance thing that may be more influential, because we just need to make sure we check all the boxes so we can still support our customers and be compliant, as opposed to ones who aren't. Then it's like, we just need to get things done and do good work and make sure that we're taking our customers, give them the features that they need.
I mean, I think it's a correct answer. And there are a lot of great examples here, around, you're right that it depends, like different settings lead you to a different reality. I guess, though, sort of a related sort of challenge on that would be, should it really be the same team? Like, should we have one cloud? It feels a little bit like you have an organization, let's call it a 50-50 split between applications you sort of operate and applications you build. If you lean one way or the other, wouldn't it, like, that team naturally be kind of mediocre at best on the other front versus the former? Like, should we have 2 distinct cloud security teams, one focusing on bucket one and the other on sort of like one on the IT cloud and one on the app cloud? Should we have different sets of tools? Like, why are we joining them?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I would say yes, because if nothing else, yes, they're different tools. Yes, they're different people. If they understanding, if you're small enough, you may have someone who can understand the one. If you understand one, you understand the other, and so that's where I kind of go back to, this really depends on how big you are and how many resources you have to be able to split them up. Because many organizations, I mean, I've seen twice this statistic, and that in the US, the number of corporations with less than 500 people are 99.9% of all the number of corporations. So we're talking about like the Fortune 500 and then 3 million other companies, right? Yeah. So oftentimes in our industry, we kind of cater to the bigger companies that have resources, have money, and can buy things, but we still have to address the 99% who don't. Yeah. How do we make something that would be accessible to them, realizing they have a lack of resources, a lack of talent, a lack of money to be able to support the tools? So that comes back to the fundamental that if you have good people, you don't need a lot of money, you don't need a lot of technology, because they're going to figure out how to do it and they can script things out and automate things. And so really, I would kind of go to the education and the development of those resources to make them understand it more fully. And we're all still maturing together. In that you have some of the really big providers who like have a 15-year head start of everybody else, Facebook and Microsoft and Google and Amazon, et cetera. But outside of those 4, you have the rest of the world who is still kind of catching up to get to their level. It's
a good point, Ole. If you look at analogies in what happened in the industry, then what happens is they get embedded into software development with DevOps. They look at the QA. Right. Initially, everything had to go through QA. Then QA was for some applications, and some of them had like developers, and even actually it still exists, but it's less common, the dev QA, the sort of like someone who is QA but is automation oriented. And then eventually today in a cloud native company, it tends to not be any QA people. Quality is a responsibility of the development team. And ops is a little bit similar, right? Like increasingly at the beginning, there is no ops person. And then eventually there's an ops person and they kind of cater to some aspects, but a lot of the others are responsibility of development. So security maybe it goes there, but maybe I'm slipping us into sort of the third bucket. Is it like, where do you think we're headed? Like if you imagine answering these questions in, I want to sort of give it a far enough for practical, like 5 years time and sort of doing it. What would you say is the reality then? What should the cloud security practice and ownership look like?
And so certainly there'll be a lot more automation. I mean, I think that your description was a very good one and a very realistic one for what could happen as we get more understanding, then we expect more from the people because they now understand it. The challenge is that, and you know better than I do, developers not taught security. We have to kind of impose it on them. And when they pick it up, they're great. And they figure out stuff we didn't even think about. It's like, wow, these are really interesting things. But I think that building security into developers and also educating security into developers more commonly and more early on, and educating the cloud architecture elements early on that give them understanding, because now they have, or they may have, responsibility for infrastructure of code and spinning up different things in different ways that they didn't have in traditional development. And so I think that there is a empowering of the developers, but what do we expect them? Because some people just want to do the one thing that they understand, because security people are a different personality type than developers. You have developers who can cross over and with exception, but traditionally there's one group of people who like to follow guide rails, understand syntax and do something and solve problems. And others who have no structure, you figure it out. It hasn't been done before. So you're the one who has to like understand, you have to come up with a solution to it. Yeah. And those two personalities are not the same. Obviously there's exceptions where they cross over. But I think the short answer is, like I said, automation. And maybe this is where, and I always like cringe when vendors talk about machine learning and AI, because my first question is like, how are you vetting that? Because AI is biased and AI
it'll generate something, but
so there's a whole, when talking to my peers and organizations who are really doing AI, they spend as much on the QA of that AI to make sure the provenance is good and it's not biased towards something that's not going to give them bad information. So taking that off the table, I think there is a play, because fundamentally machines do things in a rapid sequence very accurately, and humans are slow, messy, and prone to mistakes. And when we start automating, there's some things, and when I was CISO 10 years ago and I had a guy who was a developer, we would do some response first and then he would script it out. So it's like, okay, well, I don't have to go to these 3 machines and pull these logs. I will just script out, if this happens, I will pull these, make a ticket and send it to the human. So let the humans do the things we're good at, which is ambiguous data, understanding complex concepts, understanding things that aren't like necessarily in the view of the circumstance, business reasons and things like that. But let the machines do the stuff that they can do very well. It's like, okay, if this particular workload comes up and it doesn't seem to be trusted, just take it down, spin up another one. If that's still there, then let's look at this source. Let's go look at this thing. Let's go that. Let's fix this. Let's update the configuration, send it to it, and then send a ticket to say, I did all this stuff. And if you didn't like it, you can back it out. Really heavy automation to support the humans in that effort, because as we're getting more and more into DevOps and DevSecOps, we got to step back and just be there when it all goes wrong as a human.
Yeah, and just sort of be open. I wonder, like the word that jumps to mind, if before we talked about kind of the adaptation to the cloud, and then secondly, the sort of the automation, whether that sort of future phase is a combination of simplification, AI being kind of a big part of it, like make it easier, because developers, not everybody might have the security knowledge or aptitude. So you need to kind of make it easier, and maybe embedding it into sort of the regular practices, doing it so that the person getting that sort of prompt or that issue or that problem isn't the security person that needs to route it to a developer, but rather goes directly to the person at hand. Is that sort of reasonable?
Yeah, one of my best descriptions, somebody had said, I forget that website, the whatever AI GTP or whatever.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, that the thing that is replacing is interns. Like the things that are very simple tasks that are done repeatedly, let the machines do that. And so I think if that's what you're saying is like, and someone years ago had kind of told me a story. I'm not a chess player. They said like the question of like, which is better, the machine or the human in playing chess? The question is, what's the best chess player? And it's a human with the machine, because machines will make this this is a really good move or really bad move, but it's not good at the ambiguous ones in the middle, which humans are really, really good at. And so I think the humans leveraging kind of these types of automation along with what they're doing to make them more effective and efficient, but then still falling back on them for the things that only humans can figure out.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of almost more like offloading than it is simplification. Right. It's more about take it off my hands, either move it to the platform, move it to an AI logic, move it to somewhere else. So I didn't need to worry about it. And then you narrow the sort of the slice of it.
Right. And it frees them up to focus on the things that only they can do, like figure out how to make some feature and functionality work, because all the heavy lifting and all the grunge work they would normally have to do is already taken care of for them. And same thing for security operations, same thing for configuration management, same thing for vulnerability management.
Right. It sort of applies to the different. Well, it sounds like we figured it out. Okay. So we have like a journey for the super interesting, Rick. I think like a great journey. Thanks for sort of the insights here. And we talked about, just kind of to recap, sort of starting from the definition, the somewhat over-encompassing kind of definition of cloud security that includes a lot of things. Talk about your journey maybe starting, or at least the simplest part of it is just sort of the cloud adaptation for applications you operate because you've lifted and shifted or you just purchased them, continuing to cloud-native applications that require a bigger leap sort of as individuals and humans because they move you into automation land, naturally requiring different mindset, different sort of maybe coding skills or at least scripting skills, the likes, and then evolving into use of more kind of elaborate infrastructure and AI and deeper workflows so you can offload more work and embed it more sort of into people's daily lives. And then if you have all of that, then you kind of have cloud security pretty nailed. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it sounds good on paper. The application of it is the hard part. It's kind of like that Gary Larson cartoon where it's like, here's this calculation, then a miracle happens, and then here's the answer.
That's a good sort of tone to phrase this. Rick, this has been excellent. Thanks a lot for coming onto the show.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. Love talking about this.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.